Okay, so this is Eric Espenheid, Chair of the GSSB. I'd like to bring our meeting to order for this morning. So thank the board members for being here. Today we're going to take up, as indicated yesterday, we're going to take up more of the details with regard to the transition to the GRI standards from the G4 guidelines. We'll start with a discussion or a presentation with regard to some of the overall organizing principles for the work of the GSSB and the Standards Division in the development of these transition standards. And then we'll get in after the morning break, start getting into actual examples or mock-ups of what some of these standards would look like, and hopefully airing for the board's benefit any questions or concerns about the way that these standards would appear as we make the transition from the G4 guidelines. So that'll be the purpose of actually most of today, not only this morning, but we'll continue on this afternoon with some other elements of the guidelines and that transition to standards. So I think with that, I would ask Laura from the Standards Division to start us off.
Good morning, everyone. This is Laura Espinac from the Standards Division. And today I will be walking you through this session and through most of the sessions that we have planned for today. And joining me also is Jack Walter. He is the technical writer within the division. And together we are project managing the transition to standards. So he will contribute throughout the sessions, and he will also lead the next session on the conceptual framework. So the aim of this session now is to give the GSSB an update on the progress that we have made so far in developing proposals for the transition and in developing the initial mock-ups of the GRI standards. The aim of the session is mostly for information purposes and to gather some initial questions and comments from the GSSB. I will first cover a bit of the background of the project very briefly, and then I will go on to summarizing the proposals, explaining the approach that we've taken for developing the mockups, and I will finalize by giving an overview of the next steps for phase one of this project. To briefly...
And to be clear, we're using item 18 of the materials, right?
Yeah, we're using item 18.
Yes, thank you.
So to briefly recap on the purpose of this project, the GSSB has tasked the division to develop proposals for transitioning the G4 guidelines to sustainability reporting standards. And the GSSB has identified this as one of the key priorities for this and the next year. The transition is going to focus on the format and the presentation of the GRI standards and on transitioning the existing content of G4 into this new format. New content is not going to be developed. As part of this project, the project is limited to devising a new format and structure for the future GRI standards and on transitioning the existing content into the new format. The transition is going to be undertaken mainly by the Standards Division without the need of a project working group or a technical committee, but the project will follow the due process protocol, which includes public exposure on the draft GRI standards. There are a number of aims or objectives that we set out at the beginning of the project based on the feedback from the GSSB. 6 broad aims and 5 broad aims, and the most important of which is to devise a format for the GRI standards that allows the GSSB to update them on a continuous basis and independently as needed based on public input to the GSSB work program. Another key aim is to make individual elements of G4 easier to find. So the transition gives us an opportunity to make the content more usable and easier to find. Another important aim is to preserve the reporting principles, so the 10 principles that we have for defining report content and report quality. So there will be no changes to those principles. And also at the same time, we want to maintain or emphasize even more the focus on materiality that was reinforced in G4. Also, very importantly, we want to ensure minimal disruption to the requirements in G4 and their methodologies. So any changes that we will make to the requirements are going to be minor changes to improve the clarity of the requirements, to reduce any duplication of content, and to eliminate any ambiguity in the requirements and the methodologies. And finally, with the transition and with the new GRI standards, we also want to allow for flexibility in reporting options and formats so that the users can tailor the GRI standards to their own reporting needs and to the needs of their stakeholders. So these aims have been the basis for developing proposals to transition the content of G4 to standards. And there's 6 groups of proposals that we have developed. I will briefly summarize each of the proposals, but due to time constraints, I won't have time to go into detail for any of the proposals, but if you have any specific questions on any of the proposals, I'm happy to elaborate on those. The first proposal consists in a system to organize the GRI standards and to structure the content. The G4 guidelines are going to be the basis for the initial set of GRI standards, and the G4 guidelines are going to be broken down into smaller pieces, and each of these pieces is going to become a standalone GRI standard. There are 5 types of GRI standard that we have designed, and the G4 content will be allocated into the 5 types. The first type is the conceptual framework. There's only one such GRI standard, and the conceptual framework standard is the entry point for the full set of GRI standards, and it will include the in accordance criteria, and it will also explain how to use the set of GRI standards. The second type is the reporting principles, and we will have 2 standards, one for the content principles and another one for the quality principles. The third type is the general disclosures, and there will be 5 standards for the general disclosures, and they provide the contextual information for the performance and the impacts reported. The fourth type of GRI standard is the management approach, and we will also have 2 standards for the management approach. One will contain requirements for a narrative explanation of the management approach, and the other standard will contain indicators to report the extent to which certain processes have been implemented throughout the organization. Finally, the last type is the topic-specific standards, and here each of the G4 aspects, such as water emissions, child labor, will become a standalone GRI standard. And the aspects or topic standards will be organized according to the 3 dimensions of sustainable development: economic, environmental, and social. And at the moment, we are looking at a total of approximately 40 standards that will make up the initial full set of GRI standards. The second proposal is on a naming convention for the GRI standards. So a system to name each of the individual standards within the set. And this is fairly straightforward, but there is one outstanding question with regards to numbering the individual GRI standards, and we will cover that in a moment. The third group of proposals is on the typographic convention for the content of the GRI standards. So how to use different typographic elements to emphasize different content within the standards. For example, the use of bold to indicate that something is a requirement, or the use of paragraph numbering to help with the navigation of the standards. Another group of proposals is on a convention for the meanings of the verbs used in the GRI standards, and this has to do mainly with the modal verbs such as may, might, should, can. And in the next session, when we look at the conceptual framework, we will discuss this in a bit more detail. We also have a group of proposals for numbering the disclosure requirements. In G4, we have a specific system in place, and now we need to devise a new system to reflect the new structure of the standards going forward. And finally, the last group of proposals is a set of revision principles that the division will use to review or revise the content of G4 before this is transitioned to the standards. The aim of these principles is to basically improve the user-friendliness and the overall quality of the G4 content without actually changing the requirements. So these are minor changes to improve the overall user-friendliness of the text. There are 6 such principles. The first one is on relocating G4 content. So this is one of the aims that I mentioned at the beginning. We have now an opportunity to make certain elements of G4 easier to find and to improve the overall usability of the standards. The second principle is on eliminating unnecessary duplication of G4 content with the aim of reducing the complexity and the volume of the text. The third principle is on removing unnecessary guidance in G4. So this is guidance deemed of little value or not really necessary for correctly applying the GRI standards. This will help to shorten the text, and it will also help users of the standards to focus on the relevant information. Some of this guidance that is deemed not necessary will not be deleted permanently. Some of it will be provided as a separate guidance document, such as the linkages to the OECD guidelines and the UN Global Compact. So that content will be provided as a separate linkage document. The fourth principle is on eliminating ambiguities in the G4 text to improve the clarity and to ensure the optimal application of the GRI standards. The fifth principle is on grouping together requirements that deal with widely applicable processes. So these are contents in G4 that deal with widely applicable processes such as risk assessment, impact assessment, training, and so on. And because these contents are widely applicable, what you see is that they are duplicated across the different categories of G4, economic, environmental, and social. And now with the transition to standards, we have an opportunity to reduce this duplication and to group this type of contents into one standard. And finally, the last principle is on updating G4 content. So these are minor updates to content that will become obsolete or outdated with the transition. For example, updating the GRI content index to reflect the new structure, updating references to disclosure requirements, sections of the guidelines, and so on. All of the proposals that you see in item 18 are straightforward in the sense that they represent the recommendation of the standard division based on previous feedback from the GSSB. And we don't have any outstanding questions with regards to the proposals, except for the proposal on how to number the GRI standards.
If I could, before we go there, we could just confirm with the board that these revision principles in terms of how we're, from an overall standpoint, making the transition from G4 to the set of GRI sustainability reporting standards that we're talking about. So any question, any concerns? I think one of the things that we're trying to avoid is wholesale change, and just to emphasize that, recognizing that there is likely to be some content. I'm specifically addressing the update of G4 content item is so, as the standard division knows, and that we previously discussed, but I just want to make sure we're still on the same page, that we're trying to avoid, to the extent possible, making any wholesale content changes to the G4 guidelines. And so as to emphasize that this is a change in formatting, not a change in content for the current users of G4 and those that would be moving to G4 this year for their reporting year. So that if we're clear on that. So Bastian?
Yes, in item number 18, lines 430 to 438, this is the summary for the content updating exercise that we anticipate at this point in time. And I think one way of summarizing all these changes that are outlined there is that we're not affecting disclosure requirements as such. We're making the structure, a new format work through these changes.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the board? Okay, thank you. Laura?
Thank you. Yeah, so we have one outstanding question for the GSSB, and that is with regard to how to number the GRI standards. And currently we have two options. One option is to number the GRI standards using Arabic numerals. And this is the approach that we have taken for developing the initial mockups and that you have seen in the materials that we have circulated. And the second option would be a combination of an acronym, for example, EC for the standards under the economic category, with an Arabic numeral. So those are the two options, and in item 18, starting in line 471, you see the two options implemented to the provisional list of GRI standards.
So, questions from the board? Preference from the board with regard to it? Sulaiman, please.
I do prefer to keep the combination of acronym and Arabic numerals because it keeps the idea of continuity with G4. The organizations are used to have to call the indicators are EC, something EN, something SO, something. So I would prefer to keep it in order to cause minimal disruption between on the transitioning to standards.
Okay, thank you. Nukar.
I also support that to have the minimum disruption. Let us go with the acronym and Arabic numeral.
Okay, Judy?
Yes, me too. With both Suleiman and Kumar for the same reason, and also it's quite satisfying that what used to be SO1 or whatever, or EN1 in G4 is maps pretty well onto what that.
So that's so I'd ask either Bastian or Laura to comment on that,
All right,
because
thank you.
while just to be clear, well, we can use a lettering acronym. They will have a different meaning within the standards than they had under G4. So it runs the risk of actually being more confusing than clarifying it. So let me ask Laura to comment on that, so that we have that information, before we conclude, because it is, I agree with the comments that were made, that if it was a one-to-one transition, it would be useful, but it is not. So please, Laura.
Yeah, so that is correct. To give you an example, EC1 in G4 is the first economic indicator, but because we are now changing the structure, EC1 in the new structure would refer to the first standard within the economic category. So the meaning changes. We would be retaining the acronym, but the meaning of that will change, and that can create confusion. Another downside to using this system is that we are introducing new acronyms, one for each of the types of GRI standard, as you see on page 16 of item 18.
Let me go back to Slimov, please. Did you want to make any revision to somebody? Thank you.
No, I do support to keep the economy, because it was the same from G3 to G4. Some indicators did change, and it's got more confused to change from the letters and numerals to only numerals. Because in my experience supporting clients, it's quite easier to show them, well, I'm talking about EC something, so I'm talking about an economic indicator or standard. I'm talking about SO. This is the main thing. SO now translates every single social indicator. So we don't have the labor, the others, the product indicators, even though I can understand what Laura just said, but I don't think that eliminating the economy will generate more confusion than keeping.
Okay, Dwight?
This is just a question. In the numbering system, it can be anticipated that someday you would add new standards that are not there, and you would also remove standards that were there. Would it be right to assume that if you're removing a standard that was there, that number disappears for good? And if you're adding a new standard, it would always be the next available number up?
That would be correct. So we would vacate the number if it's been superseded or removed. So let me go back to Judy now. Sorry. Okay.
Just based on the last bit of conversation, I mean, just sort of looking at the headings, I had assumed that there was reasonable overlap between the G4 contents and the new standards. If that's not the case, then I would just want to kind of reserve I'd want to change my previous support for this, but only insofar as I'd kind of like to see more about really what the level of confusion might be between one system versus another, because I do think that there's value in maintaining the appearance of consistency as much as the actual consistency.
Okay, Kristen?
Yeah, I'm a bit in doubt, and as Judy, I would like to see more of it, to see the real consequences. But the intuitive feeling is that some sort of sorting the different standards. So these are the environmental standards, these are the social standards. these are the management approach standards, and these are the standards that are not yet invented, would make it easier to talk about. It would make it
Right.
easier to give a colleague the task to, well, you have to work on these standards instead of you have to work on number 1, 5, 7, and 10. And by the way, I forgot that you also have to look into number 15. It could become very complex if we are not dividing it up in some or another way. But maybe it would be preferred not to use the old indicator acronyms because they are, in a way, already taken.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Michael?
The reason I like having acronyms is because if you don't have acronyms, you end up with what looks very disjoint. So new standards, the sequence of standards goes 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 43, for instance, and that just looks odd and it doesn't say, doesn't communicate. But I very much support what you just said about maybe don't use the old acronyms, use something else, even if it's as simple as capital E, small c, or something that distinguishes it from the old indicators, maybe a way of breaking the nexus but keeping the logic.
Okay. Nukar?
Yeah. Still, if I read the line 557, you still say sustainability reporting standard EC1 economic performance. So it is matching with the old one.
In that particular case, it does, but that is not the majority of the cases. That happens to work. So I agree.
Thank you.
So I think, I'm sorry, David, yes.
Yeah, it's going to be unhelpful if we just have a great long list of numbers. So breaking it down and having acronyms is very useful, but it's going to be tremendously confusing if EC3 is no longer EC3, it's something totally different. So we need to have a way to manage that. But I would support the idea of acronyms, but we still need to have either start the numbers much higher up so that it doesn't interfere anymore, or change the acronym, or have big warning signs, but something needs to be done to make it clear.
A health warning. Okay, thank you. So I think did you have another comment? Okay. Just to sort of summarize where we are, at least what I'm hearing is that if we separate this transition question from if we were starting fresh and this was the first time we were doing this, I'm getting a sense that having acronyms to help group the standards is useful. Is that the consensus of the board? So I think the initial answer is yes, acronyms. Then I think we get into the subtext of, can we change the acronym, the EC or SO or whatever it may be, although we have created some new ones, as a result of at least the first categorizations in line number, 541 through 554, I guess. So, and then an interesting idea is that we actually start this with, this is EC 100 as opposed to EC 1, actually as a way of trying to smooth that transition, to signal very clearly that this is not EC 1, this is EC 100, and you need to go read what EC 100 says, as opposed to thinking you know what it means when it was EC 1. I don't know what the implications of that are. We're going to run out of numbers. We're into the millions by the time we're done here or something. But so I'm not sure what the implications of that are. But it sort of has some appeal. Although starting everything at 100 it might look odd to some people. But what's comments, Dwight?
Yes, we did a study of this, and it's actually impossible to run out of numbers, Eric. No, what I wanted to say is I think you're also hearing something else in the desire to keep acronyms. And what you're hearing, I think, is a desire to preserve the three dimensions of sustainability: the economic, the social, and the environmental. And I think that that's important. And well, that's the only thing I want to say.
Okay, thank you. Judy?
Yeah, I like that idea. Just let's do some new numbering, and keep the same sort of signifying categories. I think that helps with the consistency and the sort of familiarity for users, without it being overly familiar to the degree that users may confuse themselves as to what it is and what it isn't. I would be surprised, and I don't have a problem with starting with 100. I think that's perfectly fine. My opinion.
Okay. Jürgen, I think I saw you.
I would not agree with that, because I believe as more complicated the number, as bigger the number is, as more complicated gets the process and to memorize. I would believe that we may overestimate the confusion we are afraid of when EC3 in future is not the same as EC3 in the past. It may cause a problem for 1 year only, but we have to think in long terms. What we are doing is a work and a process that will be valid for many years. For 1 year, some people may think, "Oh my God, that I was wrong. It is now something else." But the next year, the problem is resolved already. In the long run, the advantages are much bigger to keep the system simple. As we said, the 3 acronyms and then the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I would be in favor of keeping it this way.
Okay, thank you. Michael?
Just sparked by what Dwight mentioned about keeping the 3 pillars of sustainability. I mean, you often hear the acronym ESG, which is governance, of course, G being governance. So not advocating, but just wondering whether it might be worthwhile making governance a separate section. I understand it is a section in what was the standard disclosures, but whether we want to move in that direction or not. As I say, I'm not advocating, just a thought.
Okay, thank you. Simeon, I think you were next.
Okay. Another reason I can think of to not support using the same set of acronym is that a lot of users of the reports compare historical numbers. And if we were to say EN1 today versus EN1 in the previous years, it does cause a lot of confusion, and it does break that continuity and comparison to the previous numbers. So I would think that's another point of consideration. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Kirsten?
Due to the transition periods, having different issues being named by the same acronyms and numbers do make confusion. I see that frequently when discussing with analysts, for instance, when we are discussing about different indicators, and they haven't even an idea about that a GRI indicator named from G3 can be different from the same indicator or another indicator with the same name in G4, and they don't add the G3 before. So I do really believe it would be good to get new names, completely new names. And starting in 100, well, we should of course not start on 100, we should start on 101. And then it would not be so difficult to remember. It will take some time before we will reach 200, and definitely a very long time before we will reach...
Run out of numbers?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, just, Simeon, I'm sorry. Are you? Okay, Michael?
I just wonder whether we should consult the people who do the XBRL taxonomy about this, because whether it has any implications for that or not.
So just one thing to remind the board, I think we've covered this before. There will be, as part of the whole transitioning approach, there will be a mapping exercise that we will do relative to the G4 old indicator numbers, whatever we've had, to where it resides in the new standard. So there will be this mapping that will be part of the transition documents, if you will, in terms of how, because, again, we're trying to make this as easy as possible, notwithstanding there'll still be some confusion along the way, but we will do the mapping. So whether we call it, we get rid of an acronym and just call it 34, it will show a mapping of where that was in G4. And so the mapping exercise is part of our transition plan. Now, how quickly people pick up on it and understand that, is subject to, some debate, I suppose, but it will be part of our material. Sebastian?
Yeah, maybe in addition to that, I think when you look at developments like XBRL, the crucial consideration there is that you have a unique identifier for each and every data point. And the labeling actually doesn't matter that much for the technical solutions because it is part of the taxonomy, and the conversion table that Eric just referenced, that would basically be a translation between two taxonomies, the G4 and then the forthcoming GI standards taxonomy. So the unique identifier is the crucial element coming from consultations with the people that we have developed our current taxonomies with. I don't think they're necessarily concerned about whether it's EN or social or whatever it is in terms of abbreviation. But we're watching this space also with this overall approach.
Okay. So just to review the where we are. So we like acronyms. I think we're there with acronyms. I think the open question is whether we ask the standards division to develop proposals for new acronyms, which I personally think will be a little challenging if we're trying to conceptualize these still within the economic, environmental, and social context. I'm not quite sure we want to change that terminology, but so that's one thing we could do is to ask. We want acronyms. We're just not sure we want the same acronyms. At least in terms of the lettering, or we could say now that we'll start with 101. I agree with Kristen's comment. We'll start with 101 as opposed to 100. So what's the sense of the board? I mean, I think acronyms. I think where we're stuck is, there's those that are concerned about the smoothness of transition and those that are concerned about, how do we position this for the future. So, Simone.
I reaffirm that I would keep the same acronym in terms to smooth the transition. It's quite easy to explain why EC1 it's not anymore what it used to be, because we got the situation between G3 and G4, and even between G2 and G3. So we can get it. I would keep it.
Okay, Dwight. Sorry.
Before we leave the subject, just one more idea that we should think about. An alternative to acronyms might be following a similar way that the ISO does something. So you have all of the economic indicators might begin with, say, 2000s, and you use 1,000 so you never run out of numbers. So the economic ones are 2,000, the social ones are 3,000, the environmental ones are 4,000, and then you have the numbers. And you can see easily from the number what the category is.
No, thank you for that. Judy?
Yeah, I think there are two parts to this. There's the letters that we use to signify the categories, and then there's the numbering system attached to it. For the first part, for the letter signifiers, my personal feeling is that we either keep exactly EC, EN, and SO the way that they are now, or maybe we look at what Michael suggested before, that we maybe do capital E lowercase c, capital E lowercase n. That's okay too. It still means the same thing as far as most readers will be concerned. And then the numbering is a separate issue. And I sort of have the feeling that we need some advice from the standards division as to what might be at stake in terms of starting with 101 versus 1,000, 2,000. Any of those kind of things. But for me, I'd be happy with either keeping EC, EN, SO exactly as they are right now, or just the slight modification that Michael suggested before.
Okay. Dwight? No. Kirsten?
I certainly support to make this standards division to look a bit further into this to see the different consequences. I disagree I certainly disagree that it was no problem going from G3 to G4. As I mentioned, we are still struggling with that on the G4, and people don't understanding the difference between G3 indicators and G4 indicators. And I really think we should avoid that problem also going forward.
Okay, thank you. Judy, did you have a further follow-up? No. Okay, so I think,
in here.
yes, please, Daniel.
I'd like to. I have an echo here. Sorry, guys. I'd like to second Judy's opinion. Big changes make people uncomfortable, and to whatever that's worth, I would vote for not having big changes in the acronyms.
Okay, so I think where we are is, I think I'm still hearing, notwithstanding Dwight's comment about how we could number them in thousands, that acronyms are useful. I think what I'm getting the sense of the board is that we'll ask, give some thought to new acronyms that might be reflective of what the grouping of the standards are intended to cover. And then also, notwithstanding a change from EN or EC or SO, the consequence of using starting at 101 for each of those. So I think we're good with acronyms. I think that's the sense. So I think the challenge is it a carryover of the existing acronyms, notwithstanding they have different meaning, or another alternative to how we could differentiate them from G4? Notwithstanding, we'll have the mapping in any event. No matter what we call this stuff, we'll have the mapping from G4 to the new standards. But Bastian?
Yeah, then just to summarize from the standards division perspective, what we would do is we expedite developing a proposal on these specifications or along these specifications. It is quite important that we sort this out in the coming weeks, just the amount of work that goes into reworking this throughout all the standards that we're looking at. Laura was mentioning that we're looking at 40 that go eventually for public exposure. That is significant since there are cross-references and everything. So we will try to sort this out in the coming weeks, meaning November, and come back with a more specific proposal.
Okay. Everyone good with that approach? All right. Laura?
Thank you. Next to the proposals, we also have 3 items for further consideration by the GSSB. And these 3 items are also important for the discussion on in accordance. I will briefly summarize the 3 items, but the idea is not to discuss this during this session. But when we go through the mock-ups, we can tackle them one by one on a case-by-case basis. So the 3 items are to review the status of indicators that deal with widely applicable processes. So this content is based on existing content in G4, but this is a new element within the GRI reporting framework, and therefore we need to review the status of these indicators if this is something that the GSSB wants to go ahead with. Next is to review the status of additional disclosure requirements contained within the G4 guidance. This means that G4 contains additional requirements as a recommendation, but which are not required to be in accordance. And now with the transition to standards, we need to revisit the status and decide whether these contents are mandatory or optional for the GRI standards. And finally, there are a number of requirements within the GRI standards that are generic in the sense that they can be applied to multiple economic, environmental, and social topics. And now with the transition, there might be an opportunity to emphasize that these requirements can also be used with other material topics that the organization has identified. So not only those that are covered by the list of GRI standards. So these are the 3 questions that we will bring up later during the day. Following the proposals, the division developed initial mock-ups of the GRI standards. And we have circulated these, and we will be discussing them in the next sessions today. We have developed 8 mock-ups. And what we try to do is we try to develop at least 1 mock-up for each of the types of GRI standard. And what this will allow us to do is, once we agree on the format, the structure, and the sequencing for each of these types, it will then be easier for the division to roll this out to the other 30 standards that we still have to work on. So we have mock-ups for the conceptual framework, the 2 reporting principle standards, 1 of the 5 general disclosure standards, and the 2 standards on management approach, and then 2 mock-ups for 2 of the topic-specific standards.
So just to be clear, the nomenclature that you've used to identify them was the numbering as opposed to the acronym approach, right? So just so we're clear that that these were prepared, the mock-ups were prepared using the numbering sequence, not a acronym approach.
And this will change going forward.
Okay.
For each of the mock-ups, as you have seen, there is a clean version. And also a track version which shows the changes compared to the G4 text. And we've also included a summary of the changes based on the proposals and the content revision principles. A few disclaimers about the mock-ups. The new text that you see in the mock-ups is work in progress. So it is a place that we have used to try out different terms, different formulations. But when you provide feedback, do not focus too much on the wording, because this will change in the coming weeks when we work more hands-on on the editorial review of the text. But the type of feedback we're looking for is whether the text is going in the right direction and whether we are covering the right messages in the new text. So in the coming weeks, we will focus on the editorial review of the text, and we will cover things like the tone of voice, the preferred ways to construct sentences, the use of the verbs, terminology, and so on. Some of the new terminology that we have tested in the mock-ups is the following. We have not implemented this terminology all throughout. So this is what we will be doing in the coming weeks. But to give you a few examples, we have used topic instead of aspect, since topic is a much more common word using common language. We have introduced terminology around disclosure requirement. So there was a bit of confusion in G4 when we used the term disclosure to refer to the requirements. So we have introduced this now, and we still use disclosure to refer to the resulting disclosure within a report. And then we've also introduced the terminology for the management approach requirements. So there's a new structure now for the management approach, and we had to reflect this in the terminology. So management approach and narrative is the term that we have chosen to refer to what used to be the G4 DMA in the G4 guidelines. So the narrative requirements for explaining the management approach. And then management approach indicators is the term that we have used to refer to those indicators that deal with widely applicable processes. In the next sessions, we will go mock-up by mock-up, and the approach that we will take is that the division will summarize the changes for each of the mock-ups, and then we will highlight those items for GSSB decision. In addition, we also want to welcome any additional feedback on the mock-ups, and we have 4 overarching questions for you to give feedback on. So one is whether the proposals we've seen have been adequately implemented in the mock-ups, whether the changes to G4 content are clear based on the summary that we have provided, whether the information given in the new text is clear and comprehensive, and whether the content within the mock-ups is presented in a logical sequence and is easy to find. So we will bring these questions back again when we go through the mock-ups. And just to finalize a brief overview of the next steps. Following this meeting, the division will implement the feedback from the GSSB and further develop and refine the proposals and the mock-ups, and we will also work on the editorial review of the text. By the first week of December, we hope to submit to you near final versions of the proposals and the mock-ups for you to discuss during the 17th of December meeting. So we should come to a conclusion by the end of this year, 2015, and after that the division will work on implementing the agreed approach to the entire set of GRI standards. And the ambition is to have the draft GRI standards, the entire set, ready for public exposure by the end of the first quarter of 2016.
Okay, thank you. Any questions as to what we're being asked to do over the next day or so as we review the mock-ups? Okay, so I think we're currently at our morning break, so we will resume at 5 minutes after the hour, if we could. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're back from our break, and so we'll continue now with the detailed review of, in terms of the transition to GRI standards with the first mock-up on the conceptual framework. I suspect we'll have some commentary on the terminology of conceptual framework, but let's start with that one. And so Laura, or Jack this time, okay.
Good morning. Yeah, this is Jack Bolter from the Standards Division, and we're looking at the first mock-up of the day, which is SRS-1, the conceptual framework. It's the entry point to the set of standards. And basically, so if everyone has that mock-up at the ready, item 19, SRS-1 conceptual framework. There'll be three, hopefully brief parts to this presentation. Firstly, a bit of background information about this and the other mock-ups. General information about the form that they're currently taking at this speculative stage. Secondly, we'll take a quick look through each section of the mock-up, just to identify what's in there. And as we go through each section, each chapter, I'll flag some key information that's given within these sections. And this is information that would be great to have discussed, because it's information that, as things stand, we know we're going to have to express it. Whatever the final wording, whatever the final structure of the standards, the presentation, this is information that right now we know we need to formulate it and express it to people. So I'll flag some of those key pieces of information within each section. Lastly, we'll highlight some of the things that might be really valuable for discussion. The reason to do this is usually you're given a big list of specific matters to address and comment on. That doesn't apply here. This is new, or it's a new way of reframing G4's content. So to take the place of that big list of questions, we've got some general contextual stuff for the discussion and things perhaps that might frame the discussion, things that might be really valuable to look into. So if everyone has that mock-up at the ready, we'll go. This is SRS-1, so it's the entry point to the set of standards. It's the standard that tells you about the set of standards and how to use them. And the how to use information is basically to be communicated via the in accordance criteria. So there's two caveats there already. We've started on the caveats. Firstly, the in accordance criteria are pending. So during the course of the year, it's been decided to base the user system, the how to use, on the in accordance. It's one is the other. But the in accordance criteria are currently pending. So we need to suffice to say, when we have a proposal for the in accordance system, even if it's a working proposal, a draft proposal, clearly that will have a very positive effect, not just on this mock-up or this standard, but on the set of standards in general. Without going into detail now, we can see lots of areas where we will be able to talk with greater clarity and confidence about the features of these standards and what we're asking people to do. The second caveat is the title, as Eric's just mentioned. We've had very interesting points yesterday that this is not, the content of this mock-up is not what you'd commonly find in a conceptual framework, in a financial standard, for example. The reason, one of the developmental reasons for that is some of you may recall that until fairly recently, the working title for this standard was in accordance / how to. So it was taking that user manual type direction. We also had discussions about whether this how to use information should even be in a standard. There are all sorts of places to host it. Could go on a website, could go in a brochure for practitioners. But along the way, we've said, no, this is a requirement. The how to use is the in accordance. So that does go some way to explaining this. If there's a disparity between the title and the content, that is why, in terms of evolution. However, it's a reasonably easy thing to fix. I think we can either look at the title or we can insert appropriate content to close the conceptual gap if needed. I don't think that's a difficult thing to fix. So why is this? Why does this standard and the others take the form they do? The main thing that we need to communicate in these standards is that we have a system which involves combining the use of documents. So the moment we've decided to split the G4 content across multiple documents, we need to keep reiterating that you combine the use of these things. Users don't just open up one instrument. They need to read and combine the use of several documents. So that is an iterative piece of information that's given throughout this mock-up and the others. The second reason that the mock-ups are currently the way they are is basically because, well, why do they have these sections? Why do they have this sequence? Why do they have a summary information section? Why do they have a purpose section? As you know, it's because this is an aggregation of information that's commonly given within standards. It doesn't mean GRI has to do it that way, but we've decided to take that approach. As Eric mentioned earlier, we've got to start somewhere. So we need a basis to discuss and to compare options. Okay, let's look at the sections of this mock-up. So beginning on page 5, lines 24 to 56, and then we have a box at, oh yes, sorry, 69, that is a numbered box. So 24 to 69, so self-explanatory really. When a user first opens up this and other standards, this tells them what they're getting into. We have, and pointing out key bits of information here, perhaps some of the key information here, we've got a short description of the GSSB and its work. That surely is going to evolve based on discussions about some of the due process materials and press releases which are forthcoming. So formulations from those will obviously need to be aligned with what's said in here. Another piece of key information that is going to have to go into summary information sections, whatever we call them, wherever they go, is the aims of these standards. What do they do? Now, in this standard and in some of the others, there are various attempts to express what these standards are intending to do, but I guess it boils down to GRI's reason to exist. This is about getting high quality information from organizations about sustainability as a part of their contribution to sustainable development. So those are two examples of the key information that's given within the summary information. As you know, we do have one specific matter to deal with right at the end of this session, which is verb use. This is the only specific piece of wording that we're going to cover explicitly. You can raise whatever you like, but the reason that we want to look at verbs as part of this session, or now, is because it's really going to help what we do in the next couple of weeks. So it's imminent. Moving on, page 9, the purpose section, lines 79 to 104. Again, it's telling people that it's the entry-level standard, that it explains what users are asked to do, how they meet those requirements, how to use. The key piece of information, or one piece of information that I'd point out here, and again, it's about getting a general sense of how do we feel about this information, not the specifics of how it's said at the moment or how it's presented, but what do we think about this information? I would point out paragraphs 4 and 5. So one key piece of information we're giving in this purpose section is that this is one of 3 standards that you need to use, need to read and understand before you get going. Okay, so before you really start using this system, there are 3 documents that you need to be familiar with. Again, for your discussion, how do we feel about that? How do we feel about that as a user system and as something that, as it stands, we will need to communicate to people? The next section, page 10, about the GRI sustainability reporting standards. Self-explanatory, really. I don't think that I'll flag anything in particular there. One deliberate omission from this mock-up is introductory material about sustainability, right? It's not been overlooked. It just hasn't been put there. This could be a place. We've got a reference later on in this mock-up in the glossary, actually, that the introductory text to G4 categories, economic, environmental, social, we've got lots of material there that could form the basis of how we introduce the matter of sustainability, what it means, why it's important, why this reporting system is fulfilling a need. So again, high-level views of the sequence of the information, what is presented and where, what gets emphasis, what does not. But again, this intro to sustainability itself could go into this section. Little note on that point as well, as a model, if we do want to attempt a definition of sustainability and a description of it, the ISO 26000 introduction to social responsibility as a subject might be a really good model to consider, because it's like a potted history of the term. How did the term arise? What changes has it gone through? Where has it ended up today? It's about 1.5 pages of text. It's not daunting. So that could be a really good model for material introducing sustainability. The next section, the set of SRSs, well, it's really looking at these types of standard. We know that we've got different types of standard. Is it 4? Is it 5? We're not quite exactly sure yet. But we know we've got standards that elicit basic information about the reporting organization. We know we've got standards dedicated to particular topics. Those standards mostly take the form of performance indicators. That's the form that your disclosure will take. And this is the kind of information that we need to impart to people. What form will my disclosure take? What does GRI consider its indicators to be for? Again, with what used to be the general disclosures, the information about the organization and its approaches to reporting, many of those disclosures take the form of statements, for example. So these are the kind of descriptions and the high-level view of the different types of standard. On the following pages, we've got a table which expands on that. It's the reason for each standard to exist. It's got fairly pithy, speculative drafting about which organizations will use these standards and why, and what form their disclosures will take. The division's preference for expressing this information when it's developed is very much to go down the infographic route, a visual route. It would look very nice as a schema or a chart across a spread, or we've got a PDF, but you know what I mean. But for reasons of inclusivity and accessibility, we'd like to present this information visually, if possible. The features of each type of SRS, page 16, perhaps a bit of a misnomer at this point. I mean, what it is, it's a map of the contents of each standard. Again, our preference would be to express this visually with an infographic. For example, as mentioned in the italic text, lines 144 to 146, we could have the contents page of each type of standards, the 4 or 5 types, with text boxes coming off. This is your purpose section. It tells you what this standard is for. This is the meat of the standard. These are the disclosure requirements. And in this type of standard, they take the form of indicators. In the management approach narrative standard, obviously, we'd be telling people that their disclosures take the form of narrative explanations. So that's the raw information that this section is trying to present. Page 18, you will notice a blank field here. It's the reporting in accordance with the SRSs. We know that we have the G4 in accordance system to base this in accordance system on, perhaps, as was mentioned yesterday, even with really quite minor changes around the edges, some presentational changes. But again, just to mention that when that in accordance system is in place, it will have a very positive knock-on effect on what we're expressing overall. Basic steps for using the SRSs, again, speculative, it's in draft, but it looks nice and simple at this point, especially if, again, we present it visually as a graphic or a scheme, a visual, showing a decision tree, for example, showing people the different combinations and routes that they will go down to combine these different types of standards to end up with optimal, comprehensive reporting. GSSB and the development of the SRSs, well, throughout in this section, self-explanatory. Another thing to pick up on is that I've heard quite a lot of feedback in recent weeks about wanting to emphasize the credibility and origins of our material, of our product, G4 and the previous versions. We have got a very strong legacy. It's a widely agreed system with a lot of stakeholder inputs. So that would be the place to talk about this, to talk about how GRI has ended up with a credible and reasonably widely agreed reporting system. Obviously, the wording about the GSSB, again, there's various pithy sort of descriptions of the GSSB throughout these mock-ups. Clearly, that needs to be aligned, as I've mentioned, with things like the forthcoming press releases, and that terminology needs to be aligned. I think that within these mock-ups, we've still got an independent body within GRI and other sort of things that need tightening up. But again, in terms of keeping the focus on the actual type of information, rather than the specific presentation right now, the fact is that we know we're going to need short descriptions of the GSSB and what it does. Even if they don't go into the standards, we're going to need them possibly for all sorts of communications, for use by journalists and so on. So how do we feel about this information? What do we want to emphasize? What's the priority? What's the hierarchy of the information? Glossary of key terms, again, self-explanatory. This is where we've got the note that we can repurpose the category introductions in G4 for an explanation of sustainability or a useful introduction to it. But this is the key terms that are going to be used throughout the set of standards. Each standard will have a terms and definitions section. This is the big stuff. If we were to continue using the term aspects, this is where we need the tight explanation of what we mean. That's it in terms of the high-level run-through of what this is presenting. And again, pulling it back to the introduction there, the reason it's taking this form is that it's an aggregation, as are the other mock-ups, of information that's commonly expressed in standards. And it's also dealing with this matter that we have a multiple document system. This is key. So some framing for your discussion to take the place of a big list of specific questions. Well, appropriateness and completeness of proposed content, the in accordance criteria, the really defining thing notwithstanding. But what do you think of the types of information that are given within this standard? Are they appropriate? Or within this mock-up, are they appropriate? What's the priority? Bit more detail on that. Dwight mentioned earlier, we're looking at the structure and sequence. Absolutely we are. There's been some internal feedback within the division this week, not so much in this mock-up because it's going to need a fair amount of introductory material in it. But in some of the other mock-ups, we've had internal feedback that it takes too long to get into the disclosures, the real meat. There's too much preamble. Now, that's not uncommon for standards, but it doesn't mean that we have to do it that way. So again, we are looking at structure, sequence, hierarchy of information. Overall impressions of the direction this is taking, as has been mentioned, this isn't the only way to do it, but we need to start somewhere. And also the messages, what do you want to emphasize and what not? So these are things which hopefully are useful. Certainly from the standards division's point of view, it will be very useful to have some steering and some input on those matters, this high-level view of the direction this is taking. To reiterate, the editorial phase, the presentation phase, I will also be project managing the design of this, which came up yesterday, working with the design agencies, and I know that we want iterative involvement there as well. That's all about to start. So we're not starting it just yet. It's imminent, but to try to keep the focus on the general concepts, the general structure. Finally, we do have a specific question, which is meanings of verbs. We're going to need set meanings for these things, which we currently don't have in G4 for evolutionary reasons. This is based on the ISO system. They're not the only ones who use it. Lots of people use these meanings or versions of these meanings. So can means doable. May means you're allowed to do this as far as the GRI standards are concerned. Might means possible. It's a theoretical possibility or a situation that might exist. And should is a recommendation, but we're not sure we're going to have to use that because there are different ways of encouraging, for instance, further disaggregation of a disclosure because it provides optimal or comprehensive disclosure. So we don't know. The one that's missing so far is shall, right? Now, there are reasons for this. Firstly, we're not sure we're going to have to use it. Grammatically, there are so many ways of presenting these disclosure requirements that we don't know yet that we need to use shall. You can phrase these when you look at the titles of indicators, you can phrase these as statements. You don't need to make them imperative. So we're not quite sure that we're going to need to use it. It will have an effect on the tone because it's commonly used in financial standards, for example, where you get into trouble if you don't do these things. Well, that situation doesn't quite apply in the same way to GRI standards. So we don't know yet that we're going to use it, but we definitely will need to use these others within instructions, when we're giving background information. We'll definitely need to use these others. So one specific thing to discuss is, are we okay with this system for the verb use? What do we want to firm up about it? That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Dwight?
Yes, well, I wanted to get to that question on the verb use first, because I think it's overarching to everything. And of course, in the transition to standards, presumably we're going to want to behave closer to what standards do. And in terms of my experiences, which is at the ILO and at the ISO, but also in many other standards, the real important distinction, the one that's really important, is the difference between should and shall. And I think that this gets to what we want to mean by in accordance. And I think that if you want to create standards that have a way of determining whether they're being applied or not, then we would want to consider very seriously, I think, putting the verb shall in different parts of these standards so that you can actually determine whether somebody has applied the standard. One of the things that I think that the GRI has been living off of is fudges between, well, yes, of course we're talking about sustainable development. Oh, but sometimes it's the sustainability of the reporting organization. But well, no, wait a minute, it's sustainable development. And I think that sometimes the whole experience of over the many years of when is a report a GRI report? What does that mean? And we've had lots of discussions. But I think this might be one of the real good opportunities to provide a mechanism that would settle certain issues. As when we recast the standard, when we define these commonly used terms the way they're defined here, let us add the word shall, and let us use the word shall to set the way in which one can say this particular standard has been observed.
Okay, thank you. Kirsten?
Yeah, I'll just continue on the verbs, but I have some other comments too. Verbs are very difficult to translate, especially these verbs. So if these are in accordance with what is already being used in, for instance, ISO, I think we should definitely go for that, because then there are already standardized ways of translating it. Unless you can really get into trouble when we do the translation, and as we discussed yesterday, there is lots of need for translation.
If I could, are you going to a different subject? I'd like to just finish on the verb usage, as long as we've taken the last item first. Michael?
I'd be interested to know from Jack why the current mock-ups have been phrased without an imperative. It seemed to me you had a reason for that. I'd just like to explore that further because my first preference would be to go for shall. But if you've got a reason, I'd like to know.
Just drafting and getting the information down is the reason. Also, some consideration for a softer tone, because we do get stakeholder feedback, especially internationally. People don't necessarily, GRI users don't necessarily expect to be spoken to with the commanding voice. It's hitherto a voluntary system for a start. Also, yeah, it makes it warmer and lighter. However, we're certainly open to the option of using it. And in fact, we can start drafting along those lines so we can see how it looks, and we can do that from now.
Judy?
As has already been indicated, I feel like there's a lot in the conversation around in accordance criteria as far as kind of sorting through this list of verbs here, because I'm not entirely sure if we mean shall sometimes, and I think we have to look at that in accordance issue to understand the status of some of these a bit more. I appreciate the way that this has been broken down into the various forms of words here that could apply, and I think we need a deeper discussion of in accordance in order to actually get to an answer.
Okay, Salama?
I'm thinking about one of the main objectives of this transition from guidelines to standard would be supporting regulations, law, and others formal standards, right? So in that way, we should be more assertive. We should use imperative verbs in spite of our history. On the other hand, we are talking about not mandatory use of standards. So we shall think about what is the main objective of this transition, and then start to put a very precise language, leaving no room for doubt about what would be required to produce a GRI report. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Kirsten?
Are we then back to other things?
No, we're still on the verbs. Okay. Dwight?
Well, until the transition, the document that we produced was called guidelines. Now, guidelines always mean should. There's never a shall. But then we made such a big deal about somehow we were changing what we were doing to become standards. Now, technically, guidelines can be a standard, and I've always looked at the GRI guidelines as a standard. But in fact, if there is a difference between what we were doing before and what we were doing after, I think that we would really be wise to look at the opportunity to see what should be within any given standard a requirement, and to make it a requirement at this point in time. This is the best time to do this. And also, I don't think you can really do this list as good as it is without the word shall. I mean, even if you don't use the word shall, the reader will look at the list and say, I know what's missing. Why is it missing? So you're going to have to put shall there anyway. Let us then see where shall
should be used.
Should be used.
Should be used. Michael?
Just, I agree. I think we have to have shall or must, but whichever. But the other thing, but just on the mandatory versus voluntary nature of these standards or guidelines, it doesn't matter why you're adopting them, whether you're compelled to by law or something else, or whether you choose to voluntarily. Once you're adopting them, it is mandatory that you adopt them properly, and therefore shall, I think, is appropriate.
No. Do you have a follow-up? Other comments? So I think it's pretty clear to me that the list needs shall. I also, back to Judy's comment, regardless of whether we ultimately use terminology of in accordance or that sort of terminology, I do think that we're going to have some mechanism for ourselves determining if others in the use of our standards are following them. And so I guess I'm in the camp of several folks that I think we will be using the verb shall in the standards. So I think it needs to be here. It isn't defined up there because we didn't have it, but I think we'll take the shall means you will, as opposed, and whether it's must or shall, I think can be perhaps interchangeable depending on how it's used in the sentence. I suspect. No, it could be, or it shall be, or must be, or might be, can be. So I think any other discussion, because I think we should add shall, and I do think that we should be looking for its use when we believe that it is, in order to be reflective of the intent of our standards, you shall make those disclosures. And we'll get to the question of what that adds up to in an accordance. But for now, I think we need to have shall in here. So, okay. And, Michael, one last comment on that?
Yeah, I agree with that. It's just, on the rest of the verbs, so they look right. Although, I mean, the standards I've been used to setting, we don't make this distinction. And we use may often, and probably inappropriately, because we use it as a capability often and sometimes a possibility rather than a permission. A question though, when you're looking at the guidelines, do you find you need this level of granularity? Because it can become quite a bind in drafting if you've got all these things very tightly defined. So, but your advice is that this is a good way to go?
I think we need to try it. I agree with you about may and might. I think that's for native English speakers, there's the biggest overlap between those words. I use may all the time to mean what we're saying might means here. But I think we should give it a try, because in instructional texts, when we're telling people how to formulate their disclosures, how to present them, the fact is that there are things they are allowed to do, the things that are doable, and things that might apply. And so I think we should give it a go, but also very happy now to have made a decision about imperative voice for the disclosure items and using shall. That's a really good thing for our work, even in the coming days.
Okay. So, Dwight, one last comment on this?
Yes, and the comment is on definitions, and the question, because listening to this discussion and looking at that and thinking about it, is do we want to have in each of these individual standards a set of definitions, or do we want to have a standard of definitions that then applies throughout everything? And which would affect, and if you need to modify the word once, you don't have to modify the standards. And if we decide to add something, it would be easier to do. One of the interesting things in the ISO system is they will not use a definition if the word does not appear in the standard. There's no reason for it. And they will not have a definition unless the definition is peculiar and not the definition that is found in common use and in a dictionary. But I'm just thinking, do we want to do this? How? And this gets to the whole structural issue. How much information do we put in every one of these standards that is just repeated time and time again? And it would seem to me that the definition one might be one that we don't. It might be one where we have a standard on the definitions in this, or we put it in just the conceptual section or something like that. That's why I wanted to introduce this today.
Okay. Michael?
I agree with Dwight, and I think just the repetition and then choosing which definitions go in which standard, etc. I think it's simpler and more concise to have it just in one place. And actually, on a similar point, I noticed this rubric of definitions that's at the front of each of the mock standards that just seemed repetitive. Again, I'd just have that in one place.
Okay. Keeping in mind that, there is we have to strike a balance between the full set for a combination of the full set, creating a standalone sustainability report, and the use of some of these on a different basis. So it's just information that is being used by an organization to disclose a particular matter. And so because you could say if you can't do that, then we could slim down what each of these individual standards say, because the intent is they would never be used without all the other information that could be contained somewhere in a summary standard or definition standard. So we do have to strike a balance here, and I appreciate the challenge, right, in terms of, what is that balance? But I think at least my recommendation would be that as we develop these mock standards, that we err on the side of repetition, and we can conclude later on that that's too much. But I'm just concerned that at least for some of these, that if they are taken out of the context of a full set of these things, that our definitions, our meanings will be lost because it's not there. And so I think we have to somehow strike a balance in all of this. David?
I think that's a very good point, because it makes life easier for report writers. If report writers have to go to various different standards in order to write a report, it makes their life more difficult. Whereas if the information is in one place and they can go through it stepwise, it's much easier. So I think that's something we need to bear in mind when we think of our work of consolidating things into different documents. We should bear in mind the people that are going to use this.
Yeah, Kirsten?
If it's possible to simplify, to use fewer verbs, that could be an advantage. For instance, in Norwegian, which is not a very critical language to translate in this context, but it could be an example of the challenges. There is no distinct difference between can and may. The only way you can express may is to write a whole sentence. And that could be similar challenges, could be also in other languages.
Okay, thank you. Dwight?
Yeah, basically what we've done when we've broken the guidelines into all of these standards, we've then identified certain standards, including the one that we're discussing now about the conceptual framework, as necessary to use for any standard that you do use afterwards. So therefore, that would make a very logical place to put this kind of definition, which then, together with the other explanations, which then always apply. And then I suppose what you could do is, if you were dealing with a specific standard later on where there was a need to define a term, you could define that term, which would then be in that standard. And then later on, you could also put another place to collect all of the terms where GRI has defined standards. But I would think that, that there is a virtue in not having so much introductory material that is identical, that you create a sort of fatigue, particularly when you open up the standard for the first time and you have to read all of this explanation before you get to the standard. Obviously, you're going to need an introductory paragraph that says what precisely you're looking at and who developed it and what it's supposed to be used for and how it fits in with other things. And then perhaps also at the beginning, you might have specific terms defined that are used peculiar to the standard, but I think you want to limit that so that somebody, when they open up into the standard, do not have to go through several pages of what is essentially the same language in order to get to the actual standard. So there is a user-friendly attitude approach to this that I think actually tops the user-friendly attitude of having everything in one place. I think that it probably would work better. But in any event, we've already agreed by definition that you have to use standards in conjunction with other standards. And therefore, I think it's perfectly fine to put these kind of definitions once, and it's in this particular standard we're talking about.
Okay. Other comments, Kirsten? That was not a comment. Okay. You had other comments on the document? Okay.
Generally speaking, I think that this works very well. I have only minor comments to the standard number 1, which I have already sent to you. But I think this is very promising. There are a couple of the proposed standards that I have more significant comments to, and that I see we have to work further on. But in general, this shows that this is the way to go, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Nukar?
So I agree with Christian's views, but however, I'm just pointing out to the line number 30 to 35. Do we require this line number 30 to 35 in all the mockups or all the standards?
Well, if we are, it's going to be revised in any event. But yes, thank you for pointing that out. Other kind, Judy?
Yeah, thank you. I also think this is generally a very promising document. I'm probably not alone in not liking the title. I don't think, I mean, even with the extra explanation that Jack gave us on this, I just don't think it says what it is. I don't think it tells users enough to make it very friendly for them. And I'd be concerned that it's one of these things that looks very boring and you're just tempted to skip it. And I think there might be something that we could do with the presentation of 1, 2, and 3, because they're all 3 of those together are foundational standards, as it were. And there might be a kind of stronger way to signify that. And I genuinely, I would kind of make this, rather than conceptual framework, I would make it instructions for use or something like that, even though that's maybe not quite the right language for a standard as other people use it. I just feel it has to say more on the label what it does. That's my only feeling about this. Thank you.
Okay. Dwight?
Perhaps instead of the word conceptual, we sort of get the idea of foundational. And you call this in some way a foundational standard. So you make it clear that every other standard requires this standard to work, or you can have first foundation, something like that. But I think the word foundational might be a better idea than conceptual.
Michael?
I think this is helpful. I just have a bit of trouble sort of getting it all in my head because there's quite a lot of steps in here, and I just wonder whether they all should be in the same document or not. The ones that stick out to me that maybe should not be, well, is the in accordance with, because that will have imperatives in it. So that maybe that's the only part that is actually a standard, and the rest of it is a preface or a foreword or something like that. That's my thought on the overall. I've got some wording things, but that's my overall thought.
Okay, Judy? So I think I would concur. I think there's a sense, I didn't see anybody objecting to the idea that we should find a different term or terminology for this standard from conceptual framework, because it at least for those of us that come from the accounting world, this is not what is meant by a conceptual framework. So whether it's foundational or whether it's organizing or something else, I don't know if there's other suggestions, but we could ask the Standards Division to come up with a different terminology. You've heard a couple of suggestions as to what that might be. And perhaps, we can give that a bit more thought. Bastian, you were going to comment. No, not that one, the other one. Yes.
flight attendant.
New buttons.
I have one follow-up question to the summarizing remarks and Michael's last comment, and that is, would you see the in accordance description and the two principles, sets of principles, quality and report content that we have, is that on the same level? Would that make a package of the same content? Because if we have a preface and a lot of the contents that are now in this document would form part of the preface, then we would have to group the standards that you would have to go through in any case. I think that could potentially be a way forward, that we say there's three things then that are the shell, you have to do that, and these are the three things. Otherwise we would split this out over multiple different baskets of things, and I think that would go against consolidating also the things that users have to go through in any case. So, because this will be probably the first question we have when we sit down after this meeting, how do we approach that?
Please.
One minor comment on the page 9, the footnote number 2, where the term topic is used in the sustainability standard, is to be understood as instead of sustainability topic, let's keep the environmental, economic, and social and governance topics.
Okay. Other comments? I think what please, Michael.
Do you want comments on words and a bit more granularity or not?
Well, so we can, but I guess I'd prefer that we try to keep the conversation to the overall concept, the flow, and the pieces of this. I think individual editorial, as was tried to be emphasized both for this one and the other ones, is that these are not the final edited versions of the language. So I would ask that if you have some specifics, please provide them, but not in the course of this dialogue, unless it has something as fundamental as the comment we just heard with regard to, if we're going to call it a sustainability topic, let's be more explicit in terms of the three pieces. So, but other than that, if there are editorial comments, you please provide them. But I'd like to keep the conversation. Do we think that the flow of this and sort of the idea, recognizing Dwight's comments with regard to, is this the home of all definitions and that would be used, which I think has some merit, and then new definitions that are explicit and only relate to an individual standard that would have a glossary or a terminology specific to that standard, which I think has merit. I think the challenge, of course, is, and again, Dwight raised it, and I think others have, is that, to use any of the other standards, there are these three that should be, shall be, could be, maybe might be, apply, is a key component. And so I think that somehow, and I think there's a placeholder for that language, I acknowledge, but that would be an important element of this first one, to make it clear that while we encourage and expect the full set of these to be used to have a comprehensive report, to the extent that there is use of an individual one, these elements, so these standards, the first three as we have it structured now, are required to make it understandable, useful, and in accordance with GRI. So let me, Simeon, please.
From a reporter's perspective, I'm having problem getting my head around how am I going to demonstrate in accordance to this particular standard, because it applies to all the other standards. So if a user were to use any other standard, then they would probably have to be in accordance with this one. And then there was an initial comment yesterday saying that, we haven't discussed this in detail, but there was an initial comment saying that we should probably keep the two levels. And I cannot imagine how one can demonstrate in accordance core to this particular standard, because you are either in accordance or you're not. Right,
You
so
either
I
applied
think-
it or you
yeah,
haven't. I mean, it's
so I
binary.
think that's an application problem with this particular standard, with the information that's in it.
So just so I may, so I would take from that you would think this is some form of application guidance and not a standard.
Yes, I think that's what I'm trying to get at, but
Without,
yeah,
be clear. Yeah. Reactions, responses to Simmons, Kristen?
It's probably a valuable comment, and maybe a two-tier structure could sort that out.
Okay, other comments? So I think, Michael?
I've just got four sort of wording things, but they're pervasive. So if I could just mention those briefly. One is in a footnote on page 5, we say where the term sustainability is used, it means sustainable development. If we use one word to mean something else, why don't we use the something else? So why don't we use sustainable development? Yeah. On page 10, the singular of sustainability reporting standards is GRI standard. That doesn't make sense to me. The singular of sustainability reporting standards.
I'm sorry, what line were you on?
On line 109 and 110. The singular of sustainability reporting standards is sustainability reporting standard. Page, oh no, it's a general thing that comes up a lot, but it's line 175, references. We say they're included. I don't think I'd include references in standards, but maybe we discussed that with G4, didn't we? And we agreed that we would. I just have a thing about referring to other sources inside your own standard. It doesn't sort of gel. And the last thing is, and maybe later it comes up, but on line 184, it says that the first step is to look at these 3 standards, no matter what you're doing. But the content principles, you only need to look at if you're preparing a sustainability report, not if you're doing an indicator. So I think that's needs to be thought about further.
Well, we'll have that discussion because I'm not sure we all agree. I'm not sure we all agree with that particular comment with regard to the content principle. So, Dwight.
On response to one of Michael's points, I think in the ISO practice, they have a section and a standard that provides documents that are intended to be read in conjunction with the standard that you're using, so that you have to have that as a reflection. But then the list is always very small, but it's the ones that are the essential background that you have to accept in order to do something like that. And I think they call them normative references or something like that. And that might be what was intended here, in which case I think you can expect that if you have that category, that it'll be empty in many of these standards. But there might be a place where you would need to put something like that, saying you must have this as a normative reference. And of course, the way we're thinking right now is maybe this foundational principle standard would be one of the normative references for all the other standards.
No. Okay. Other comments? So, do you have a summary of where we go with this one? No.
Yes. So I think all the points that have been made basically can be summarized under 3 high-level observations. One is the contents that we currently have are too dense in terms of putting them in one standard. I think that needs sorting. The sequence is something that we need to look at for that, and this holds for the first one as well as the ones that we are going to discuss. In particular, this reference to sorting between guidance on how to do something and those things then that have the shall component, the requirement. This seems to be the key thing that we have to solve for this particular one. There is an issue also with which contents should, going forward, form part of the standards overall that we have now already identified. And I think this is the second main discussion we will need to have. And the references is an important one. We have inherited a system for that. We have flagged up in earlier discussions with the GSSB that the list of references that we're currently providing is not quite right. But that requires attention now, I think, because it is a quite substantial subject. It's carried through, in particular, the topic level standards. And the last observation that I would make is that regarding the in accordance, I think what I'm hearing is that with the next version of this, what would be helpful for the discussions of the GSSB is to have, at a minimum, an indication from the standards division how the current in accordance compares with this and what are the elements that can be carried forward, plus two additional text elements. One is more instructional text on the two routes that you can take in applying the set going forward. And the second element being a draft text around describing the new way of using the standards or the second way of using the standards, and that is choosing individual ones to reference in your reporting efforts on certain subject matters. And I think these are the priorities for the team, and once we start to go back and structure that. And then, of course, all the points about the verbiage, and that is all taken on board.
Okay. So in this case, this is a newly created, so there is no equivalent in G4, right? So this is, well, in some respects, I suppose you could say it is, because it's a combination of guidance and other indicators of how to apply G4 and so on. But so there is, this is a first formalization, if you will, at least in the form of a standard that okay. So there's opportunity for further work to be done on it. I do think this question of references will come up in each of these, and I think we need to address, how we want to handle that. Perhaps it might be more useful when we have the explicit examples of how it's used in some of the other mock-ups to take up that discussion at that time. So, okay, so clear? All right, let's move on to our next one.
So next, session 2.5, we're going to look at the mock-ups for the two reporting principles standards, the content principles and the quality principles. And I would suggest that we tackle each of them one by one.
Okay.
So let's tackle the content principles first, and that is item 20. As I said, I will first summarize the changes that you find in this standard, and then I will highlight the items for GSSB decision. The aim of these summaries is to just highlight the more substantial changes. We have applied many other minor changes based on the content revision principles, and you find those summarized within each of the mock-ups, but due to time constraints, we won't be able to go through those one by one. So for this one in particular, the key changes or the key things you need to know about this this standard is that it contains the principles for defining report content from G4, which are stakeholder inclusiveness, sustainability context, materiality, and completeness. As mentioned earlier, no changes to the principles themselves, other than fine-tuning terminology or clarifying something here and there. This SRS also contains the process guidance for defining report content. So previously in G4, this used to be in the implementation manual under the general disclosures section. And now with the transition, we're bringing this guidance closer to the principles for defining report content, because what the guidance does, it explains how to apply the 4 principles in a sequence in order to define the content of the report. So this is the most appropriate place for this type of content. So all the minor changes have been implemented as per the content revision principles, but nothing that we want to emphasize at this stage. There is one item for GSSB decision now with regards to this standard, and that is the status of this process guidance for defining report content. So in the context of G4, this process is a recommendation by GRI, but it is not a requirement to be in accordance. What it is required to be in accordance in G4 is to apply the 4 principles, to explain how the organization has defined the content of the report, and to explain how the 4 principles have been applied. But the guidance and the process and the different steps are not a requirement to be in accordance. Now, with the transition, we need to review the status, and we want to confirm whether this is still a recommendation, or whether the process or specific parts or steps of the process need to be required going forward. If it is decided that the process, it's a recommendation, not a requirement, there is still the possibility of presenting this content as a separate guidance document rather than within the standard itself.
Okay, thank you. Comments? Questions? It's clear. Nope, okay.
Yeah, I was just going through this, and I find that I was finding that against each of the 4 principles, we have retained the test. Normally, I have not found in standards the test. So, do we require the test, or should we move the test portion somewhere else? Thank you.
Okay, do.
Well, I can probably shed some light on earlier discussions that we had in developing the guidelines, in particular G4. Back then, a decision was taken to basically only have the definition of the principles in the first book of G4 and the explanation around the principle in the implementation manual. That is probably the reference to how other standards do this. However, it is also something we see in application of the G4, that oftentimes users are not quite clear on this additional guidance, and you can see in how they apply the principles that they haven't understood the principles to the full extent. And so bringing it together again, including the test, is one way of dealing with this. Another way of dealing with this is clearly to, when we talk about layout, formatting, structure, and linking contents, that there is if we decide to have this as part of guidance and separate, that it has to be flagged up that there is additional information about this. But yeah, I think this is the background information. Is there anything, Laura, that you would add to that?
Yeah, Kirsten?
It's a rather challenging question you are asking. And it would have been easier if I had had that in mind when reading through it. But when I'm now glimpsing through it, I did not react to this being a part of the standard when I was reading it in the language it is now phrased. But seeing it from the perspective that it should be mandatory, the mandatory process, then I think this is too detailed, because we cannot instruct a reporting organization that you should do it exactly like this, step by step. There could be certain requirements, principal requirements, a checklist that is required to use and that should be included in the process, but exactly how to do the process should be a guideline. So I do believe that the main issues here could be required, but not the detailed text. The detailed text is a way explaining a way of doing this, but it is probably not the only way of doing it.
No. Dwight?
Well, I think the way to handle this is to take advantage of our new definitions of verbs and rewrite this to indicate what are possibilities, what are recommendations, and what are requirements. And obviously the requirements wouldn't be to follow all of the details. We would make clear when something is just being described as a possibility and something is being described as a recommendation, but somewhere in there should be a requirement related to the process. And I think that we just look at it with sort of fresh eyes and a new set of verbs.
Other comments? Michael?
You're looking to comment specifically on whether this is in the standard or not?
Yes, that
Yeah.
and anything else related to it.
I would have thought it shouldn't be in the standard. I'm like Kirsten. I think it's a sort of a how-to-ish, a bit too how-to-ish for a standard. But if it is there, then it needs to use the verbs appropriately. But it just seems a bit how-to-ish for me.
So just to be clear, you would feel, and Kirsten, you would feel that the initial description of the principles of stakeholder inclusiveness, context, materiality, and completeness are part of the standard. The process for then taking those principles and applying them which is labeled on the process of defining report content, is guidance. And so I want to be clear. So your recommendation, it's not in the standard, it's somewhere else. It could be made reference to and usable and so on, but it is not intended to be the cookbook for doing this report content, defining report content. Is that?
Yeah, that's correctly understood.
Michael, is that okay? Other comments? I'm sorry, I don't. Judy.
Thank you.
Didn't see your signal.
I think what's so challenging about this, because I had sort of the same feeling as Kirsten did, that I wasn't really looking at it with the correct eyes. The standards that are to come after this, the kind of EN5 type of standards, they're written in such a way that they say, report the such and such. Yeah, report the fill in the blank. I'm finding a very few instances in this where there's an actual instruction, and it boils down to things like select material topics, prioritize material topics, things like those are the instructions, and it doesn't actually say anything about what goes into a report. It's that what gets reported must reflect this process. And that's what I'm finding quite difficult here to sort of separate out, thinking again in terms of what we are trying to get reporters to do by using these standards, rather than how we are hoping to inform them and educate them and deepen their deepen their expertise in something further down the line to enable a better report to happen. I think that all just, to cut a kind of long story short, I think that all just means that I feel like this is just not the same thing as the other standards are, and therefore it's not written in a way that I would kind of be able to put it in the same sort of box as the other standards. I don't know if that's at all helpful, but I think I needed to sort of sort that out in my mind. I think I'll just stop talking.
Okay, thank you. Dwight?
Yeah, maybe as a way forward, we might ask the standards department to drastically edit out that process section to make it quite short and see what that looks like and whether it's appropriate. Now, on a different point, the sustainability context. I have always had, since the first time I read it, a problem with the sustainability context, because it seemed to me to sort of be based on an extending by an analogy, something that was extremely important in the environmental area to areas where it didn't apply, which was in the economic and social area. But even here in the text, it's very clear that it, the text indicates that, well, this may not be the same thing. So now my only point here, and I certainly wouldn't want to be accused of suggesting that we need to change this in the transition period, but it does have a bearing if we were dealing with what would be in accordance with or not, and whether this concept would be treated at the same level as some of these other principles. But I just wanted to just make a marker on this, because I think we have to strive to not change a lot of things, and I'm not proposing to do that. But at the other hand, I think that there is an orange in this pile of apples.
Okay, thank you. Judy?
Yeah, I think picking up on that, I think that's one of the things that I sort of have in my mind, that as we transition to standards, we haven't dealt with the question yet of third-party assessment against standards, and it's quite an important thing for most reporters. Just as we have many reporters doing third-party assurance on their sustainability reports, there's a great deal of process that has to underlie that you would never expect to actually be in a sustainability report, but that encompasses the evidence for that can be assessed in order to do a third-party assurance, and I feel like that's what's being described in large measure here. So that this is in a sense a completely different type of instruction. This is very deeply in my mind tied up with the in accordance issue.
Okay, other comments? Michael?
On different topics? Yeah, or on that?
No, there can be a different topic.
Okay.
It has to be related to this item, but
Yes.
can't be talking about lunch.
No, okay. So I've got a number of sort of things I'd just like to raise, and I'll just go through them. A lot of it's on the purpose statement. I have some difficulties with that. So on line 878, it says the reporting principles are fundamental to achieving.
Sorry, which line?
878. The reporting principles are fundamental to achieving transparency, which sort of makes transparency the overarching goal of this, and therefore a principle in itself. And I'm not sure that's the case. It's, transparency is just transparency, anyhow. So maybe that's wording, but I think it comes up a bit where we talk about transparency. Am I in the right document? 878?
Well, you're on the marked version of it. It actually appears in the clean version on line 103.
Right. Okay. So sorry.
But it's okay. It's the same document.
Yeah. All mine are in the marked. Yeah. Probably. Okay. Yeah. So that's transparency isn't a principle in the GRI context. So I'm not sure why we bring things back to it. I mentioned this before. The next 8.1, the principle for defining report content established. Okay. You don't need to follow these content principles if you're only reporting in accordance with one standard. And you indicated, Eric, that you may not agree with that, but I think it's something we need to explore as to whether you do need to follow these content principles. Just reading that sentence, the principles for defining report content establish the process for identifying topics to be reported. This involves considering an organisation's activities, impacts and substantive expectations and interests of its stakeholders. That's a lot of, that's very substantive comment to make. I would have thought it actually involves considering the organisation's impacts only. Okay, its activities relate to impacts. 8.2.
106. Yeah, depending on whether you're looking at the marked version or the clean version, it's more off by 800 lines. So. Considering the substantive expectation and interests of stakeholders, again, only to the extent they relate to impacts. So impacts is the overriding principle. You don't separately consider activities, impacts and expectations and interests of stakeholders. And I think that's sort of, I think it's a very important point, actually, because it's to do with materiality and what actually you're trying to achieve with the sustainability report. Okay, they're the main things. Yep. Okay. Dwight?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. It was behind the water glass.
So I'm thinking about what we should convey by replacing aspects for topics. Excuse me, because I'm thinking about the main, the fundamental aspect of the materiality principle is to define how to report the impacts from an organization on economics, on the society, and on the environment, right? And when talking about the impacts, we should talk about aspects and not topics. For instance, human rights, it's a topic, it's a theme, but there are several aspects within the human rights theme that could be material or not for an organization in terms of impact. So I wouldn't replace aspects for topics, because then it changes how the companies should disclose their impacts, because it fights against the methodology of impact assessment that's already in place. And the other thing, sorry, it's about, in several parts of this document, as mentioned, reporting sustainability information. We are talking about to report how the companies are identifying, assessing, and managing their impacts. It's not about sustainability information. For me, it translates in a very greenwashing term, so I would avoid this to refer as sustainability information. But environmental, social, and governance information, performance and management, or something like that. And, well, the materiality issue we will discuss later, right? Because the substantive expectations and interests of its stakeholders relates with the materiality principle. So for me, it makes sense.
Okay. Were you going to comment, Bastian? No? Kirsten?
I think it's a very good thing to get rid of the term aspect. It's very difficult to understand. I have never got a good definition of it, neither in the G4 nor from anyone else. When it comes to the use of sustainability in different contexts, I really support you, Sulema. I haven't commented on it because I know I have an issue on the word sustainability and sustainable development, but I definitely support your comment.
A direct response to that? Yeah. Okay.
but not with 2 sentences. Can I have more than 2 sentences?
You're violating our rules now, so, but
I'm
go
not
ahead.
violating rules. The thing is, because I'm a practitioner of impact assessment, I do apply some methods to identify and assess social impacts, mainly in human rights impacts and labor and health and safety. It's quite clear that aspect, it's a component of a topic or a theme. So helping companies to perform risk assessment, for instance. We cannot perform a risk assessment on human rights by taking into consideration only the theme, but we should take into consideration aspects of social aspects or economic impacts on people or impacts on vulnerable groups, for instance. So it's a breakdown of a theme. So for me, we could clarify the term aspect within a glossary, or we can define the term in a technical way, in very in line with others that use the aspect with a very specific technical meaning. But I really think that we should avoid to replace material aspects for topics, because then it could be very hollow to have a report based only on topics instead of on aspects.
Dwight?
Just a quick response to Michael's point. I think in that sentence where you were discussing that there's 3 things, there's not 4, in the sense that I share your perspective on the importance of impacts. Although I think that the word activities is a causal factor. So there's really 3 items in the sentence, and I agree with you that impacts and which are caused by activities are the thing that's important.
Okay, other comments? Bastian?
To follow up on the topic aspect discussion, I think one approach, and we have brought this to your attention in an earlier discussion, one way of looking at this is if we present contents without consideration for the heritage that we have with the guidelines. We have at some point decided that aspect is the term to describe the subject matters where we have detailed disclosure requirements, right, in the GRI guidelines, and we have sustained this terminology. But in particular with first-time users, we keep bumping into this issue that they come back to GRI and ask, what exactly is an aspect? How does it relate to my reality? And when I see sustainability issues or sustainability topics, in essence, the only difference is that GI has defined a couple of them and others are not defined through disclosure requirements. So if we look at the GI standards with the ambition to speak to new users groups and to extend the universe of organizations, and that's certainly the ambition that use these standards, then from a standards division perspective, this is a simplification that will have very profound effects for first-time users, because it removes a bit this terminology, very specific terminology issue that is imposed by our standards for reasons that are hard to explain on a day-to-day basis. And we see that with our guidelines at inquiries.
Please.
Just to make the point that I'm okay with aspects or topics, but in the environmental field, aspects is actually quite commonly used. ISO 14000 refers to environmental topics as aspects, and so technically in this particular field, it is very well understood. Just to make that point so that we can take it into consideration.
Please.
Yeah, I apologize for insisting this, but on the social area, it's also well known what aspect does mean. So it's, and ISO also has a definition for aspects, and IAIA, impact assessment. I completely forgot what the name means, but they do have a very precise definition of aspect. It's not that hard. What is hard is to have companies really have in place a robust structure for identification of environmental and social impacts and risk assessment. This is the thing. That's why it's sometimes can be very difficult for beginners to really understand what the aspect, the word aspect does mean. It's more about the process that some organization has in place that is not comprehensive enough to identify and assess all their impacts, in my opinion.
Okay, other comments? We need to conclude on some things. So we've gotten the input. Any suggestions? I mean, I think it's an important, because it does, this question that, or this discussion we've just been having on aspects and topics, it obviously pervades the rest of the standards writing, if you will. So what is the sense of the board? We've heard arguments for and against. I mean, just a perspective is that, of course, we have now been using aspects. We're not changing the definition of how we're using aspects necessarily. I think what the suggestion, and it came out of a previous meeting, was, whether that was the appropriate terminology for what otherwise we're describing. And so there was this, changeover to topics. My recollection, and Laura maybe or Bastian, you can help me recall, there was something that we were running into that caused us to even think about changing it to topics. And I don't actually recollect it, whether it was the disaggregation of some of the elements that might be considered in aspects as we looked at some of the aggregation and disaggregation of some of the disclosures.
No, I think it's predominantly really the user perspective, and that GI has introduced terminology to make a distinction where this distinction is usually not seen, especially by those that are not acquainted with sustainability related management schemes and all of this. So first-time users of the guidelines. These are usually organizations that build up capacity in this space, and they come to it, and for them, it is a somewhat artificial barrier to entry, the world of sustainability reporting, because they have to deal with this difference. And we see that coming back very significantly in the inquiries we receive around report content definition, how to bring in the GRI universe of aspects right now into their considerations for topics and issues that are material for their reporting. And it is, that is, I think, the remark I can make.
Judy?
In and of itself, this isn't something that I feel extremely strongly about. Whether it's called topics or whether it's called aspects makes little difference to me personally. So the question to my mind is, who does it make a difference to? And what I'm hearing from Bastian, and probably from others as well, is that it's a barrier to entry for people who want to be able to use GRI standards and feel constrained in doing so because they can't get over a sort of concept hurdle. On the other hand, the people who would be inconvenienced by the change away from aspects might be people who have established systems and for whom the kind of alignment with ISO in particular might cause a little bit of a confusion. To me, the first one, the barrier to entry for new users, is more important than the sort of changeover confusion that might ensue for existing users. And for that reason, I think I'd just go along with the proposal that's been put forward, that we change from aspects to topics.
Okay, Simeon?
I remember when G4 first came out, with all my engagement in the geographical area that I I'm in, there's a very common question: what's different between aspects and topics? And the explanation we gave them was, okay, aspects are defined in GRI, and if you have more aspects, then they are of equal status to aspects in GRI, but please don't call them aspects, call them topics. So I think that was the main point of confusion. So, okay, I have another aspect. You want to call it something else. So to make the distinction. So I think I would support just choose one out of the two and stick with it. Whether if you have a new aspect, then you can call it an aspect too. But if we were to choose topic, then if you have a new one, you can also call it a topic. I think that's really the way to go.
Okay, Salema.
Well, preventing the confusion that the term aspect could make could generate in beginners, we can explain what aspect does mean within our standards. For me, it's more about the readers, about people who are seeking information on the sustainability reports from organizations in terms of how they are identifying and assessing their impacts. So it's by aspect, it's not by topic. So I do have a strong opinion on this. So I will insist, because I don't see how companies could mainly the beginners could show their systems in place by listing topics. It's so broad. It's not very informative, actually, in my opinion.
Yeah, Judy.
I mean, personally, I mean, I don't want to kind of dismiss Sulema's concern, but I mean, for readers, I don't think they do go through reports looking for the word aspects. I think they go through reports looking for greenhouse gases, or they look for human rights, or they look for governance, or something like that. And I don't think it makes any real difference to readers whether this is organized in the standards using one term or using the other. And if I'm misunderstanding you, please help me. But I don't personally really see it as an issue for readers of reports.
Salema.
If I can give you an example, some organizations that deals with health, public health, could seek for information on women's health within some reports, or health and safety of women, for instance, working conditions for women. Those are in ISO, IAIA, and others frameworks are called aspects, not topics. So human rights, it's a big topic, and some readers will seek for very specific information on human rights. For instance, labor conditions of children, or labor conditions on the supply chain, which is topic. It's a breakdown of topic. And GRI since G3, I think, Bastian, it's using aspects because of this, because the material aspects of an organization, when I really correctly identified, translates in how the organization is coping with their impacts. This is why I'm defending not replacing aspects for topics.
Michael.
I'd not understood that meaning of aspects that you're mentioning. So that's it wasn't in my mind, I must admit, when I was looking at G4, that this aspects has some other defined meaning, and it's defined outside our standards. If anything, to me, that says we should use a different word, because unless we are meaning exactly what that defined meaning outside our standards is, then we probably shouldn't use the word.
Simeon? Nope, that was a carryover. Okay. All right. So I guess I would like to. We have a strong view that we retain aspects. From a standards division view, or feedback from the monitoring program, or Bastian, you have indicated that you have viewed it, or there's evidence that new reporters have used this, or have described this as a barrier and don't understand, and so on. I guess, how strongly is that?
Well, I think it is definitely strong feedback, and to echo Simeon's earlier comments, it was one of the most complex exercises in explaining G4, that particular issue. It seems a bit strange in the broader context of making a big change to guidelines, introducing a new version of guidelines. But what we ended up with in many of the public discussions introducing it, I remember at least 20, 30 events that I moderated around this. This was definitely always in the top 3 of items that came up. And maybe also by way of background, during the public consultation for the G4 guidelines, this was also one of the top items that came up. And it was already back then a discussion, and we had in particular the users, so reporting organizations that came back after the release of G4 and said, why did you consider to remove that hurdle? So that there is evidence for the past, basically since the launch of G3, that this is a substantial hurdle.
Okay, other comments? I think to try to conclude, is there a sense that we should stick with the changeover to topics for the further development of our mock-ups, recognizing, once again, we're not approving any of these standards. What we're signaling to the Standards Division is a tentative approach to the development and the further build-out of each of the standards. And so is there, I recognize an objection to moving from aspects to topics. Is there others that will cause us to, because this has now been developed using the topics terminology, right? Yeah, I would suggest that we continue to use that, but note that there is still a strong view that the retention of the term aspects should be retained. Okay, is that good? Yeah. All right. Okay. We are approaching our lunch break. Is there more that we need to cover here? There is, of course. Yes, thank you. Laura?
So next, we should be discussing the quality principles standard, and that is item 21. And similarly, a brief summary of the changes or what you can find in this standard. This standard contains the 6 quality principles of G4.
Laura, if I could, excuse me. I think in light of the timing, I would suggest that we actually take our lunch break and pick this up immediately following our lunch break at 14:30. And I will ask my board if we could sort of expedite our comments, and I will try to do a better job of managing our time. But we will take our pre-scheduled lunch break, because I know some people have made some plans in the use of this time, and we'll reconvene at 14:30 European time. Thank you.